Welcome to another episode of Regulatory Oversight, a podcast that focuses on providing expert perspective on trends that drive regulatory enforcement activity. I'm Ashley Taylor, one of the hosts of the podcast and the co-leader of our firm's State Attorneys General practice. This podcast features insights from members of our practice group, including its nationally ranked State Attorney General's practice, as well as guest commentary from business leaders, regulatory experts, and current and former government officials. We cover a wide range of topics affecting businesses operating in highly regulated areas. Before we get started today, I want to remind all of our listeners to visit and subscribe to our blog at regulatoryoversight.com so you can stay up to date on developments and changes in the regulatory landscape. Today, I'm joined by Oregon Attorney General Ellen Rosenblum to discuss her new role as president of the National Association of Attorneys General, or NAAG. General Rosenblum has served as Oregon's Attorney General since 2012 and is the first female state attorney general in Oregon's history. As many of our listeners know, NAAG is a nonpartisan forum that provides a community for attorneys general and their staff to collaboratively address issues important to their work, as well as training and resources to support attorneys general in protecting the rule of law and the Constitution. General Rosenblum, I'm looking forward to today's discussion.
Thank you, Ashley. It's wonderful to be with you. We've gotten to do some really great things together already while I've been Attorney General and while you have been in your role with the Troutman firm, and it's a pleasure to be with you again.
Well, great. I'm going to talk about some of those things, but let's start with orienting our listeners to your background. So, what drew you to run for the office? And how long have you served?
Well, I'll start with how long I've served, which is almost 3 full terms. I have 1 more year of my 3rd term, and this is my last term that I'll be serving. So basically almost 12 years. And it seems like every day there's something new. So I can't believe it's been that long. I decided to run after having a pretty full plate of different professional activities. I had been initially in private practice, then a federal prosecutor, then a state court trial and appellate judge. I had stepped down from judging after 22 years. And along came this opportunity to run for Attorney General in Oregon. We do have to run. And so I did that back in 2012, and I was thrilled to be elected. And here I am today after 3 re-elections.
So you come to the position as president of NAAG with experience as both attorney general, as a judge, as a prosecutor, seeing the law and participating in the process from many different perspectives. All of that probably makes sense to our listeners. I'm thinking, though, the listeners may not appreciate how you become president of NAAG. How does that occur?
Right. Well, I actually had been the chair of the Conference of Western Attorneys General first. That was some time ago and earlier in my attorney general career. And we used to be sort of focused more in the leadership on geography. And so as having been the chair of CWAG, which is what we called it, it was kind of obvious that at some point I would look to a national leadership position with NAAG. That took a little while, and I'm just thrilled now to have been selected by my colleagues, I believe unanimously, to serve as their next president. And by the way, the first woman in over 20 years, which is kind of shocking because we have lots of women attorneys general now. So maybe we could say about time, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, share with the audience your role as NAAG president and what your initiatives will be and your priorities.
Sure. Well, as NAAG president, I plan to engage and already am actually engaging my fellow attorneys general in developing bipartisan programming at our events to share ideas and to foster collaboration with them. So in addition to my presidential initiative, which is America's Youth, AGs looking out for the next generation, we'll also be addressing other issues of critical importance to attorneys general and their offices across the nation. So some topics that continue to resonate include consumer protection issues, artificial intelligence, that's really huge right now, obviously, child exploitation, sadly, human trafficking, also a big issue, something that we address as a bipartisan group. So those are some examples. Happy to talk more about my initiative, which is just getting going. We kicked it off at our December Capitol Forum, and we have lots of plans for that coming forward. It's divided up into really three different areas. Technology, obviously kids, youth. To them, it's not really technology, it's their life. It's what they do every day, is using their phones and their apps and their games and all those things, their social media. And so we want to look out for them. We don't want to keep them from having a good life. We want to help them to have a good, safe life. So that is one of the areas. Another is we're calling healthy bodies, healthy minds, issues like vaping, smoking, alcohol, drugs, all of those issues obviously play into the safety concerns that we have for our youth today. And the third one, which I'm really excited about, is financial literacy and making sure that young people and their families are aware of the importance of knowing what you're getting into. For example, when you get your first credit card, when you take out your first loan. Now, when that happens varies depending on the family and the circumstances, but we've seen what happens with student debt and how that can accumulate and not be well understood by young people. And in fact, that was my initiative when I was the chair of CWAG, was making sure that student debt didn't become the obligation of a lifetime. And I think we've made some good strides there, but we have a long ways to go.
As I listen to all of that programming, I'm thinking again about our listeners. It may help our listeners for you to share some history about NAAG. What is it? It's a great platform now and it's doing great things, but the historical context, I think, would be important for our listeners.
Sure. Well, the inception of NAAG was in 1907, way before any of us were around. NAAG was initially created to discuss a common approach to antitrust issues related to the Standard Oil Company. And since then, antitrust efforts have consistently been a core aspect of the Attorney General's role. In fact, we recently hosted the antitrust lawyers from all the different AG's offices here in Portland, and I was amazed. It was a room full. And so this has continued to be a focus, but we've served as a platform for AGs to collaborate, to share insights, and to champion the interests of their respective states ever since the inception in 1907. And we continue to do that today.
I've described, and I'm wondering if you agree with this, I've described NAAG to clients and others entering the AG world as a real clearinghouse of information for AGs. It's a source of training. It's where they can collaborate. I wonder if you would agree with that characterization.
Oh, absolutely. The association offers support and assistance to attorneys general and to their staff across the country. So it's not just the 56 of us, it's all of our staff, which of course adds up to probably into the thousands. So while its origins began as a means to coordinate antitrust enforcement, the value is in providing this kind of collaborative platform. And we have seen that role expand to facilitate collaboration on a wide variety of issues that attorneys general have enforcement authority over, such as consumer protection. So AGs, I'm just going to call us AGs, we've successfully come together in a bipartisan fashion many times over the years to address a host of really huge national issues, including things like the health impacts of tobacco and the tobacco industry's marketing to youth, the national mortgage crisis, and most recently, of course, opioids, and now technology. So it's important to note that we also have this robust, as you mentioned, training and research mission, which provides training to our offices throughout the nation. This may shock you. Last year, we provided training to nearly 18,000 registrants. And those were all people that do this work in the Attorney General office space. We assist AGs and their offices in front of the United States Supreme Court. We have a program through Supreme Court fellowships and moot courts to help the lawyers get ready for their arguments. So in essence, NAAG is a means for AGs and their offices to enhance and to improve their effectiveness while they're in office. I remember my first NAAG meeting was a training for the newbies, for the new AGs, and it was incredibly helpful. And I was told that NAAG staff would actually come out to our offices to help to review our structure and our setup if we wished to have them do that. And then I learned that we actually had done that sometime a couple of years before.
I will tell you, the training, particularly for the Supreme Court arguments, is one of the best training courses I have seen in the country. And people have commented over the years how the advocacy from the states has improved with the training every year. So I wanted to commend you for what you are doing in that regard. It makes a real difference. I wonder, would you talk to the audience about NAAG as an entity? Is it a governmental entity? Is it a private? What is it?
No, it is not a governmental entity.
Okay.
It is an unincorporated association organized under the statutes of the District of Columbia. We have received a designation. I don't want to get too much in the weeds here, but as an instrumentality of the states by the IRS for federal tax purposes. Okay, so there is that, but that does not make it a governmental entity. No, our individual AGs, of course, we run state or sometimes territorial or the district, in the case of the District of Columbia, governmental offices. But this is an association, a nonprofit type of association.
I want to shift the conversation to some of your activities as AG. And I want to step back a bit because some of our listeners may not fully appreciate the fact that a state attorney general can serve both an enforcement function and a regulatory function in different ways. But the office is unique, at least from my perspective, in the sense that it's a combination of politics, policy, and the law. It's a unique combination. That also means that state AGs play a role in the legislative process, which a lot of folks may not fully understand. So, would you give the audience some insight into the role that a state AG plays, oftentimes in the General Assembly of their particular state, and the role you may have played in legislation and why you became involved?
Absolutely. I consider this job of being Attorney General to be sort of the confluence of policy, politics, and the law. And I mentioned policy first. It's not necessarily the absolute top priority. I think the law maybe, is ahead of that one, but they're all related. And so policy, I was surprised and happy to discover that as Attorney General, even though I'm not a voting member of our legislature, we call the General Assembly the legislature, I have a very significant role to play. And I think most AGs do, although everybody's is a little bit different. So I can't speak for all my colleagues, but I will say that at least in my state, I have the right during legislative sessions, during our longer session, which is every other year, to actually request certain bills. And we assist in actually formulating those bills by setting up convenings of task forces. And those task forces meet. And at the end of the day, in my case, we have had a number of extremely successful, not necessarily unanimous, but always essentially a consensus agreement that we can present on different proposed bills to the legislature. So I'll give you a couple of examples of where I've been successful in that regard. My first one was with regard to policing, to issues that related to stops and searches and those kinds of things. Police profiling, we sometimes refer to it that way. And I got a bill passed along with the support, of course, always with legislators that really was involved a lot of reform of that whole area of profiling. And I'm happy to say that I think we've made a lot of improvements, and especially in terms of record keeping and data, so that we know what's going on out there and we can make changes and we can make adjustments to have a fairer system. So that was the first one. The next one was public records reform. We hadn't reformed our public records laws since the 1970s. The time had come. We had increased the number of exemptions exorbitantly, and it was not really a manageable situation any longer. So we have made some great strides there and continue to do so. We still have what we call the Sunshine Committee that we're involved in, where we're reviewing every single one of those exemptions to make sure that they still need to be on the books, because I'm a great believer in sharing whatever the government can in terms of our records, our public records. So that was a really important one that we did. And another is, and one that I'm really proud of, is hate crimes and improving our hate crime and bias laws. It turned out that that had not been looked at for decades. And we now have, I'm really pleased to say, in Oregon, I think the best hate crime bias incident hotline that exists in the country. We get thousands of reports every year, unlike most states that either don't have a hotline or if they do, it's not so effective because they don't have the ability to actually provide assistance to people that call. And a lot of times they end up saying, sorry, that's not a crime. We can't help you. We don't do that. If it's not a crime, we help them, maybe even more so, because then we don't have to refer them or we can't refer them to law enforcement. So that's another example. Most recently, we had a very successful consumer privacy convening. We have a task force that met over 3 years. We had to take a short break during COVID, but we pivoted and we came back. And in the last session, we passed what I think is really the most, I can't say successful yet because it really has not, it's just going into effect this year. But our Oregon Consumer Privacy Act is really going to make a difference for Oregonians with a number of important rights over their personal information and imposing specific obligations on businesses who collect and use and store our data, sometimes without us even knowing what they have. So big, important changes in that regard. So all of those involved convening task forces, meeting, making proposals, bringing legislators in as ex officio members of our task forces so that they would be engaged early on, and then getting these bills passed and getting the governor to sign them, which she has in all of these instances. So really proud of the work that we've done. I'll be going to the legislature just in another couple of weeks, mostly on some budgetary items because this is our short session, but we do have some significant bills. And again, it will be my last session. So I'm feeling a little bit sad about that because usually I'll be planning for the next long session, but I'm sure our new Attorney General, who will be elected this fall, will be engaged, I'm sure, in the 2025 session. So looking forward to assisting that person going forward.
Great. I want to turn now to a function in the office. And we've been talking about the office's position with respect to legislative matters. And I'm glad you used the term convening. I've often used that term that AGs have a unique convening, what I've described as a convening authority. And by that, I've always said, when an AG calls and says, would you like to come visit with me in my office? The answer is always, of course I would. So the office has great power in that regard. And it's a power that most folks don't understand. It can be a great force for good, sharing information, et cetera. One of the powers that an AG has is the enforcement power, often exercised through the multi-state process. Wouldn't you give the audience a sense of how multi-state investigations develop that process, what it is? It's something I know that you know very well and understand, but our audience may not fully understand what's behind the phrase multi-state.
Sure. Well, multi-state is kind of what it means, which is more than one state. And often it's many states, and occasionally it's all the states and the territories and the District of Columbia. Of course, I never want to leave them out. The process developed really out of necessity. Both AGs and those involved in the multi-states sought a mechanism that allowed for greater efficiency and for sort of economies of scale to be achieved. Also, as had been the case with the Standard Oil antitrust case that led to the foundation of NAAG, multi-states allow states to combine our resources and our expertise to tackle even the largest issues affecting our entire nation. So working together, we are able to take on these challenges, whereas working individually, our ability to do so is harder, it's more challenging. So the combination of efforts in a multi-state investigation can also prevent a multiplicity of lawsuits and make the resolution of these cases more efficient for all concerned, including defendants and including the courts. So what usually happens in terms of the process is we start out with some kind of a working group. It's not necessarily an investigation, but discussions between the offices, and usually the representatives on these discussions are, well, they're always going to be people in the offices who have expertise in a particular area. So there might be a working group on technology, a working group on issues related to the consumer privacy issues, to antitrust. So those groups of individuals will have regular calls, and I think they're usually phone calls on a regular basis, maybe monthly. And then something will coalesce in terms of issues that look like they perhaps need to be stepped up for an investigation. And then that will turn into a multi-state investigation and eventually a meeting with the industry and proposed settlements, and hopefully settlements that can alleviate the need for major litigation, individual separate litigation in every state, which is burdensome, expensive. Nobody really wants that, but this can be a way to avoid that and to try to get things done as a group.
Everything you described, is there a playbook where all of that is written down?
Wouldn't that be nice? Look, no, as far as I know, not yet. But I think that is definitely something to talk about and something that our current executive director, Brian Kane, representatives from the business community, members of particularly our consumer protection committee, could look at and should be looking at. Worthy discussion. And frankly, an example of why NAAG exists and serves all of us. At the same time, however, keep in mind that these processes involve a very diverse cast of characters and participants. So while consistency is important and can be helpful, we just have to recognize that there are a lot of differences and that at the end of the day, each of us is independently selected or elected, and we may not necessarily ultimately, it's going to be challenging to agree on that playbook, but I think it's a great goal to have.
Well, your comments reminded me of a theme and a response I have heard in multi-states over the years when I advocate for consistency or all the states doing the same thing. I'm reminded by assistant AGs all the time that each state is a sovereign and jealously guards its sovereignty and its independence, right? So you're balancing a multi-state process with the need to respect that individual state sovereignty.
Oh, absolutely. I will say that people sometimes think there's a lot of, frankly, I can't argue with the fact there's a lot of divisiveness in our country, but state AGs, we are among the least political in that sense because we work on behalf of our constituents. We look for what is harming them, and we work together when we agree that there's an area that we can coalesce on. And that turns out to be lots of areas. I've mentioned quite a number of them this morning.
Yeah, let me support and reinforce what you just said when particularly entities that are not accustomed to dealing with AGs think about a state attorney general. Their first thought is a political thought. And our team's response is always that it's a lot less politics than you may think, right? The state AG as an office at the operational level is really nonpartisan. And you see that in the multi-state context when assistant AGs from both sides of the political aisle or offices on both sides work together. And you can't tell R from D in that context at all. At a functional level, it's not a partisan issue at all. And it's hard for folks who don't understand the office if they're just reading a headline to assume that it's frankly more political than it really is.
Absolutely. And one of the things we're doing at NAAG to really make sure that we are living that concept that you just were talking about is that when we have a letter, for example, that we want to issue to Congress in support of or opposing a new rule or a new law, we make sure that we have equivalent numbers of Democrats and Republicans in the lead on that letter, whether it be comments, whether it be something a little bit different. So today, I'll just give you an example. Today, I can't give you the specifics, but I was working on a letter involving some comments in connection with a proposed rule relating to children, protecting children. So something I care deeply about. And it was my job to make sure that we had equivalent numbers of Republicans and Democrats in the lead on this letter. And it was easy. It was easy. There were so many to choose from that it was kind of hard because that made it hard, but it was easy because there were so many to choose from. So I'm just really pleased at how we are working together, but also being cognizant of the need to make sure, just in case, especially since I am a Democrat and I am the leader of NAAG this year, I'm very much aware that I need to maintain my nonpartisanship and my bipartisan approach, which for me is easy. I was a nonpartisan judge for 20 years. When I ran for attorney general, it was the first time I'd ever even been able to declare what my political party was publicly since having been a judge. So in some ways, I may be ideally suited for this job right now in this moment.
One additional way that this nonpartisan approach plays out, and I don't know if you have observed this from your position as either president of NAAG or as attorney general for the state of Oregon, but I can make this observation as a practitioner. In the multi-state context, what I have seen over the past 20 years is that there have been what I've described as centers of expertise that have developed. So when you have a multi-state, and if you tell me the topic, if you tell me the topic is technology, if you tell me the topic is privacy, if you tell me the topic is data analytics, if you tell me the topic, I can pick the 3 or 4 states that are leading the effort because you've seen this expertise develop and coalesce over a 20-year period. And again, it's an example of the bipartisan nature of the work because it's R's and D's who've just worked together over time on various issues. And the states have come to view this state or this group of states as an expert in a subject matter. So you see that playing out on the ground, so to speak, in cases at the assistant AG level. And it's, again, it's another example of how the expertise is what really drives the analysis as opposed to partisanship.
I think that is true. But I also, having now been Attorney General for 12 years, I have seen some new AGs who've come in and they have some special expertise. Antitrust, as an example, with the Colorado AG. I'm not sure that that was necessarily a strength of Colorado before that Attorney General came in and said, hey, this is really important to me. So it really does make a difference who the Attorney General is in terms of sort of setting the tone and setting the priorities for that office. And often it does involve the expertise and background of that particular Attorney General. So I would say yes and no. There's a little bit of both.
That makes a lot of sense. And in our last couple of minutes, I want to turn to something that I know is important to you, and that's mentoring of young attorneys, particularly young women attorneys. Talk to me about that, what you've done, what should be done, et cetera.
Well, mentoring is just key. When I look back on my career, there is no doubt that every step of the way I have been lifted up by others. You know, connections developed through law school, practicing alongside and before litigators and judges, as well as all the diverse bar activities that I've been involved in. They've helped to shape me and determine really my course of practice and leadership. So I think mentorship is the key to modeling traits that we want our next generation of lawyers to embody, and happens to also be a relationship that grows the mentor as well as the mentee in the process. So for me, mentoring is fun, and it's also an obligation. When I, took the oath to be a lawyer and certainly to be Attorney General. So when I meet with young lawyers, which I try to do regularly, and I really enjoyed the meeting I had with the RISE program in your law firm, I always try to ask that lawyer, what do you want to do or achieve in the next 5 or 10 years? And then we talk, and over time, we kind of develop a little bit of a plan on how to get there. Sometimes it's the next year, sometimes it's the next couple of months, but often it's a longer term plan that I try to assist with as a mentor. And I also, and this is really important, I try to make room at every table for my mentees. And if they don't speak up, I try to make sure to ask them what they think. Because, there can be a little intimidation factor there, especially when you take someone into a room that they've never been before. So those are some of the goals that I have in mentoring. I just think mentoring is one thing, serving as a role model is another. And I had so many great role models. I didn't have a lot of mentors. I especially didn't have a lot of women mentors because, I graduated from law school when women were just getting started, especially as litigators. There weren't very many of us. And so I had like one female judge mentor, maybe one practicing lawyer, female mentor. So most of my mentors were amazing men who took me under their wing and helped me to grow in the profession and made me feel like I was valued and that I could do it, that I could succeed. And so here I am today, very appreciative of the mentoring and the role models that I had.
I want to publicly thank you for spending time with a number of our associates. I knew that they would benefit from just spending time with you. So I thank you for feeding into them and providing them with a role model and a vision of what is possible in their career. So I want to publicly thank you for that.
Well, you're most welcome. But as I said, I learned a lot from them and enjoyed so much the time that I got to spend with them. And I hope that we'll have other opportunities.
I want to thank you for joining me today. I know, like me, our listeners enjoyed your candid remarks and invaluable insights. I want to thank our audience for tuning in today as well. And please make sure to subscribe to this podcast via Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, or whatever platform you use. And we look forward to having you join us next time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, Ashley. Great to be with you.
Copyright Troutman Pepper Hamilton Sanders, LLP. These recorded materials are designed for educational purposes only. This podcast is not legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individual participants. Troutman Pepper does not make any representations or warranties, express or implied, regarding the contents of this podcast. Information on previous case results does not guarantee a similar future result. Users of this podcast may save and use the podcast only for personal or other non-commercial educational purposes. No other use, including, without limitation, reproduction, retransmission, or editing of this podcast may be made without the prior written permission of Troutman Pepper. If you have any questions, please contact us at troutman.com.